If you want to destroy a person, you don't attack their body, you attack their anchor. You find the one place in the world where they feel safe, where they can turn off their hypervigilance, and you burn it to the ground. By the time my taxi pulled up to the curb of the address I had called home for the last decade, my anchor was already bleeding. I had my hand on the door handle, a tired but genuine smile on my face, ready to step out into the familiar grit of my street. But my brain abruptly refused to process what my eyes were seeing. The heavy, historic red brick exterior of my building, the place that used to smell like wet pavement and roasted coffee, was suffocated by a massive grid of heavy steel scaffolding. It looked like an iron cage. Thick, industrial green mesh netting hung from the roof down to the sidewalk, flapping in the bitter October wind like a giant bruised shroud. The massive factory windows, the exact windows my grandpa Arthur used to say framed the city skyline like a living canvas, were completely gone. In their place were gaping black voids, violently coughing out clouds of white plaster dust. The dust settled over a massive steel dumpster parked aggressively on the sidewalk, overflowing with shattered timber, twisted metal pipes, and chunks of familiar pale drywall. It looked like a graveyard of architecture. For the past 90 days, I had been in Florence, Italy, on a prestigious, invitation-only artist residency. For 3 months, I was a ghost in a beautiful foreign city. I wasn't the black sheep. I wasn't the unstable daughter or the family's financial liability. I was just Harper. I breathed in cold, ancient air, scrubbed raw charcoal into canvas until my knuckles bled, and finally felt like I was stepping out of the suffocating, calculated shadow of my father's relentless expectations. I had flown back across the Atlantic with a portfolio full of the best work I had ever done and a chest full of naive, stupid hope. I thought I was coming home to my refuge. My loft wasn't a luxury condo. It was a scar and a sanctuary. It was the only thing my grandfather had left me, the only place where the word mine didn't come with a hidden invoice. I stumbled out of the cab before the driver had even fully shifted into park. I left my heavy leather duffel bag on the cracked pavement, my boots crunching over shattered glass and drywall dust as I walked in a daze toward the entrance. The heavy iron front door was propped wide open with a splintered cinder block. I stepped inside the lobby, and my throat immediately closed up. The hallway, which used to smell faintly of old pine and turpentine, now reeked of pulverized concrete, ozone, and raw destruction. The brass mailboxes had been violently pried from the brick wall, leaving pale, jagged scars in the plaster. Whoa, hey! Hard hat area only, miss. A burly man in a neon safety vest and a dust-coated respirator mask stepped out of the gaping maw where the freight elevator used to be. He held a rugged tablet in one hand, projecting the kind of tired, impatient authority of a man managing chaos on a strict corporate deadline. "I live here," I said. My voice didn't sound like my own. It sounded hollow, scraped out, like it was echoing up from the bottom of a well. "Unit 3B, that's my studio." The site foreman frowned, pulling his mask down around his thick neck. He tapped the screen of his tablet, scrolling with a calloused finger. "3B," he muttered, swiping down again. "There's nobody living in 3B, ma'am. That entire unit is a full gut job. We started the demolition phase on Tuesday." "No," I stammered, stepping past him toward the dark, debris-covered stairwell. "No, you have the wrong unit. You have to stop right now. I own that space. My grandfather left it to me. All my equipment is up there. My easels, my reference libraries, my custom canvases." The foreman stepped deliberately into my path. He wasn't malicious, but his stance was a brick wall. He was just a guy following orders, which somehow made the cruelty of it feel even colder. "Look, lady, I don't know what to tell you. I just run the demo crew. Everything inside that unit was boxed up and hauled off to a climate-controlled storage facility over on 8th Avenue last week. The sellers arranged it. The new developers bought the shell outright. We're knocking out the non-load-bearing walls and ripping up the floorboards today. It's a total conversion." the sellers. Those two words hit the back of my knees like a crowbar. The air rushed out of my lungs so fast I felt dizzy. I hadn't listed the property, I hadn't spoken to a broker, I hadn't signed a single piece of paper. The loft was my legal inheritance. The only people who had emergency access to that unit, the only people who held a physical spare key and knew the master alarm code while I was thousands of miles away in Europe, were my parents. Specifically, my father. I stood there in the ruined lobby, choking on the bitter dust of my own destroyed history. The relentless, high-pitched screaming of reciprocating saws from the third floor vibrated through the soles of my boots, traveling all the way up my spine. They didn't just sell my home. They didn't just sell an asset. Richard, a man who had spent his entire life measuring human worth by profit margins, had finally calculated that I was worth more to him liquidated. He had sold my safety. He had sold my grandfather's ghost. I pulled my phone out of my jacket pocket. My hands were trembling so violently I could barely unlock the screen. But the shock was already beginning to recede, leaving behind something much colder, much darker, and incredibly dangerous. I knew exactly why my father had done this, and I knew exactly which one of his golden investments he was trying to save. To understand how my walls ended up in a dumpster, you have to understand the man who put them there. My father, Richard, is not a man who loves. He is a man who calculates. He spent 35 years as a corporate liquidator, a man whose entire career was built on walking into dying companies, gutting them for their copper wire and intellectual property, and leaving the hollow shells behind. He didn't turn that part of his brain off when he came home. In our family, love was never unconditional. It was transactional. You were either a performing asset or you were a liability. My older brother, Preston, was his blue-chip stock. Preston was loud, aggressively confident, and spoke entirely in the language of Silicon Valley hustle culture. He was always one pitch deck away from $1 million valuation, one angel investor away from changing the world. My father funded Preston's lifestyle, covered his rent in upscale neighborhoods, and wrote six-figure checks to keep his bleeding tech startups afloat. Preston was Richard's legacy, a mirror reflecting my father's own arrogance back at him. I was the write-off, the eccentric, quiet daughter who ruined a perfectly good business degree to play with paint. My father looked at my exhibitions not as achievements, but as a cute, financially unviable phase that had dragged on entirely too long. When we sat at the dinner table, he didn't ask me how I was doing. He asked me about my profit margins, my quarter-over-quarter growth, my scalability. When my answers didn't involve compound interest, his eyes would glaze over and he would pivot back to Preston. The only person who ever saw me as a human being instead of a line item on a ledger was my grandpa Arthur. Arthur was my mother's father, but he and Richard hated each other with a quiet, venomous intensity. My grandfather was a painter. He bought the third-floor loft in the 1970s, back when the neighborhood was just abandoned textile factories and stray dogs. He raised me there when my parents were too busy attending networking galas and board meetings to notice they had a second child. The loft was a massive, drafty cavern of exposed brick and battered hardwood, smelling permanently of linseed oil and old paper. It was there that Arthur taught me how to stretch a canvas so tight it sounded like a drum when you tapped the center. He taught me how to mix ultramarine and burnt umber to create a black deeper than the dark out the window. But more importantly, he taught me how to survive my father. I remember sitting on his battered wooden stool when I was 14, crying because my father had refused to come to my first local art showcase, claiming it lacked strategic networking value. Grandpa Arthur had wiped charcoal from his hands with a dirty rag, looked me dead in the eye, and said the words that would become my armor. "Harper," he had said, his voice rough like sandpaper, "your father measures the world in numbers. We measure it in light. Never let a man who only understands price tags tell you what your light is worth. When he tries to make you feel small, you don't argue. You look at him and you stay silent. Silence is a weapon, kid. Let them drown in it. When Arthur passed away 5 years ago, my father had his lawyers circling like vultures before the funeral was even over. He saw the gentrifying neighborhood. He saw the string lights going up over the alleyways, the artisanal coffee shops replacing the corner bodegas. He saw $1 million real estate flip. But Arthur was 10 steps ahead. He bypassed my parents entirely and left the deed to the loft directly to me. I will never forget the look on my father's face when the estate lawyer read the will. It was a mask of cold, vibrating fury. I had been granted ownership of a premium asset, and in his eyes, I didn't deserve it. I wasn't utilizing it efficiently. I was just painting in it. For 5 years, I lived in that loft. I paid the property taxes. I fixed the leaky pipes. I painted until my wrists ached, earning enough from commissions to survive, asking my family for absolutely nothing. I thought my independence made me safe. I thought distance was a shield. I was wrong. Standing in the dust-choked lobby of my building, shivering despite the heavy jacket I wore, the puzzle pieces snapped together with terrifying clarity. Preston's latest startup had been hemorrhaging cash. I had heard the hushed, frantic phone calls before I left for Italy. His burn rate was out of control. Investors were pulling back. He needed capital fast to show liquidity for a Series B funding round. My father wouldn't let his golden child fail. He wouldn't let his primary investment go bankrupt. But his own liquid assets were tied up in offshore accounts and long-term bonds. He needed cash, and sitting right in the middle of the city's hottest real estate market was a massive, unmortgaged loft, occupied by a daughter he considered a failure. To Richard, it wasn't a betrayal. It was just a portfolio reallocation. He had simply decided to liquidate my life to fund my brother's ego. I stared at the site manager who was already turning away to yell at a worker carrying a sledgehammer. My hands stopped trembling. The shock, the cold dread that had gripped my chest since I stepped out of the taxi, evaporated. It was replaced by a heat so intense, so hyper-focused, it made my vision blur at the edges. I didn't scream, I didn't cry on the floor of the ruined lobby. I turned around, walked out into the biting wind, and pulled up my father's contact on my phone. The wind howling off the street felt like ice against my face, but inside my chest, a furnace had just ignited. I didn't collapse. I didn't weep into my hands. My grandfather had raised me better than that. Instead, I stood on the sidewalk, the roar of the demolition crew tearing apart my history echoing behind me, and I dialed my father's number. I listened to it ring. 1, 2, 3. With every tone, the frantic, desperate daughter inside me died a little more, replaced by something entirely different, something cold. "Harper?" Richard answered. His voice was smooth, resonant, and completely devoid of surprise. He sounded like he was answering an internal memo, not speaking to a daughter who was currently standing in the wreckage of her life. "You're back from Italy." "Did you sell my studio?" I asked. I didn't yell. My voice was dangerously flat. There was a pause on the line. But it wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of guilt. It was the mild irritation of a CEO being asked to explain a budget cut to a low-level employee. "I liquidated an underutilized asset," Richard said, his tone perfectly even. "The neighborhood's zoning laws changed last month. The commercial value of that shell skyrocketed. Holding on to a property of that scale so you can splash paint on a canvas was no longer financially defensible. It was a fiduciary error, Harper. A fiduciary error. That was what he called my home. That was what he called Grandpa Arthur's legacy." "It wasn't yours to liquidate," I said, my grip on the phone tightening until my knuckles turned white. "It was my home, my equipment, my life, Richard." "Don't be melodramatic," he warned, his voice dropping an octave into that authoritative register he used to crush negotiations. "You can paint anywhere. A canvas is a canvas. We moved your boxes to a secure storage unit. The family required liquidity, and you were sitting on dead equity. It was a simple business decision." "The family," I repeated, the taste of ash in my mouth. "You mean Preston?" Before Richard could answer, I heard the familiar, frantic pacing of my brother in the background. Then, the rustle of the phone changing hands. "Harper, look." Preston's voice came through the speaker, breathless and vibrating with that toxic Silicon Valley entitlement he wore like a badge of honor. "I told Dad we should have sent an email, but the closing window was too tight. I didn't want you to find out like this." "Find out like what, Preston?" I asked, staring blankly as a worker tossed a piece of my splintered window frame into the dumpster. "With my walls being ripped out by a demolition crew?" "You need to calm down and look at the bigger picture," Preston said, completely ignoring my question. He sounded annoyed, like I was the one inconveniencing him. My startup was hitting a critical burn rate. The angel investors were getting spooked by the market downturn. If I didn't show immediate collateral, my Series B funding round was going to collapse. We're talking about a $50 million valuation, Harper. I couldn't let my runway run out just because you're sentimental about a crumbling brick box. I stood there, the noise of the street fading into a dull, rushing sound in my ears. He wasn't apologizing. Neither of them were. They genuinely believed that my life was nothing more than a spare part, waiting to be harvested the second Preston's engine started sputtering. "It was Grandpa's space," I whispered, testing the water, waiting to see if there was a single shred of humanity left in either of them. "Grandpa was a relic," Preston snapped, his patience evaporating. "And you aren't using the space efficiently. You're doing hobby work. I'm building a scalable enterprise that will secure this family's legacy for the next century. Investors don't wait for feelings, Harper. They need hard assets. I needed that capital. So you stole it." "I optimized it," Preston shouted, his voice cracking with defensive rage. "God, you are always so selfish. You've never been a team player. Dad was right. You just take up space without generating any return. Grow up, Harper. Get a new apartment. We'll even pay your first month's rent. Just stop making this an emotional crisis." I waited for Richard to get back on the line. I waited for my father to reprimand his son for speaking to me like a parasite. But there was only silence from Richard. He agreed with every word. And right then, standing in the cold, I remembered the smell of linseed oil. I remembered my grandfather wiping charcoal on a rag, looking at a 14-year-old girl who was crying over a father who didn't care. Silence is a weapon, kid. Let them drown in it. The tears that had been threatening to fall simply vanished. The desperate need for my father's approval, a sickness I had carried in my blood since childhood, evaporated into the winter air. "Harper, are you listening to me?" Preston demanded, his tone shifting from angry to slightly uneasy at my lack of response. "Say something. Tell me you understand the equity play here." I didn't scream. I didn't hurl insults. I gave them exactly what my grandfather had taught me to give men who only understood transactions. Nothing. I pulled the phone away from my ear, pressed the red button, and severed the connection. I didn't know yet how they had bypassed my name on the deed. I didn't know what legal dark magic Richard had used to push a sale through while I was across the ocean. But as I picked up my heavy leather duffel bag and turned my back on the construction site, I knew one thing with absolute, terrifying certainty. They thought they had liquidated a liability. They had no idea they had just created a monster. I hailed another taxi, sliding into the back seat. "Where to, miss?" the driver asked. "Downtown," I said, my voice smooth as glass. "The financial district. I need to find a lawyer." Evelyn Vance was not the kind of lawyer you hired to negotiate a polite settlement. She was the kind of lawyer you hired when you wanted to salt the earth so your enemies could never grow crops again. I had met Evelyn 3 years ago through a wealthy art collector who appreciated ruthless litigation as much as he appreciated abstract expressionism. Her office, high above the financial district, was a fortress of glass, steel, and intimidating silence. When I walked in, carrying nothing but the dust on my boots and the cold fury in my chest, she didn't offer me a tissue. She offered me a double espresso and a seat. For 45 minutes, the only sound in the room was the sharp turning of pages. Evelyn had pulled the recorded sale packet and the deed history of the building from the county database. She read with the kind of terrifying, predatory focus my father usually reserved for hostile takeovers. I sat across from her, my heart hammering against my ribs, waiting for the death blow, waiting for her to tell me that Richard had found a loophole, that my grandfather's will was flawed, that my brother's startup had legally consumed my life. Instead, Evelyn stopped reading. She took off her reading glasses, tapped them against the mahogany desk, and let out a low, dangerous laugh. "Your father is a very arrogant man, Harper," Evelyn said, her voice smooth and lethal. "And like most arrogant men, he assumes everyone else in the room is an idiot. But he severely underestimated your grandpa Arthur." I leaned forward, my hands gripping the edge of the desk. "What do you mean?" "They sold it, Evelyn. The construction crew is tearing down the walls right now." "They are tearing down walls," Evelyn corrected, sliding a heavy blueprint across the desk toward me. "But they didn't sell your studio, because legally they couldn't." I stared at the complex architectural schematic, completely lost. Richard said he liquidated the shell. "And that is exactly the trap your grandfather set for him." Evelyn smiled, a shark smelling blood in the water. "Arthur knew Richard was a corporate vulture, so when he drafted his will, he didn't just leave you a standard deed. He utilized a highly obscure, ironclad legal structure called split ownership. He severed the property rights." She tapped a red pen against the blueprint. "The developer bought the building's exterior shell and the load-bearing framework. Richard had a minority stake in the building's overarching trust, which allowed him to authorize that specific sale. But Arthur legally separated the interior improvements, the studio build-out, and the airspace rights tied to Unit 3B. Those belong exclusively to you, Harper. Your father couldn't convey them to the buyer because he never owned them." The room seemed to spin. "Wait, you're saying the developers bought a box, but I own everything inside the box?" "Exactly," Evelyn said. "And right now, their demolition crew is actively destroying private property that does not belong to them. Every swing of that sledgehammer is a massive civil liability." A spark of hope, sharp and bright, ignited in my chest. But then, a dark thought eclipsed it. If that's true, how did the sale close? The title company would have flagged the split ownership. They would have needed my authorization to clear the title for a full gut renovation. Evelyn's smile vanished. The temperature in the room plummeted. She slid a secondary folder across the desk. It was the closing packet the title company had accepted. "They did need your authorization," Evelyn said quietly. "Look at the signature line on page 14. I flipped the page. There, at the bottom of a waiver consenting to the destruction of the interior rights, was my name, Harper Quinn. But the loop of the H was entirely wrong. The slant was too aggressive. It was an imitation, a forgery." "He forged my name," I whispered, the betrayal hitting me all over again, deeper this time. "It gets worse," Evelyn said, her eyes locking onto mine with fierce intensity. "A forged signature on a multi-million-dollar real estate transaction is a major felony, but title companies require notary verification. Your father bypassed that by attaching an addendum. Read the letter behind the contract." I turned the page. It was a formal document, drafted on Richard's personal letterhead, signed by a private physician on my father's payroll. "To whom it may concern, let this document serve as formal notice that my daughter, Harper Quinn, suffers from severe, documented psychological instability and erratic behavioral patterns. She is currently undergoing an extended, out-of-country psychiatric retreat. Due to her compromised mental state, she is incapable of managing her own financial assets responsibly. As the head of the family trust, I am acting as her de facto conservator to protect her equity in this transaction." I stopped reading. The words blurred together. My father hadn't just stolen my property to fund Preston's startup. He had assassinated my character. He had legally documented me as a lunatic. A broken, defective human being who needed to be managed just to push his paperwork through without raising red flags. He had erased my autonomy. I sat back in the leather chair. The silence stretched out, heavy and suffocating. I thought about Preston calling me a parasite. I thought about Richard calling my life a fiduciary error. I thought about the 30 years I had spent trying to earn a crumb of respect from men who viewed me as nothing more than an obstacle to their wealth. They tried to make you disposable, Evelyn said softly, watching my face. That isn't just theft, Harper. That is intent to destroy. I looked up at her. The tears were completely gone. The frightened, neglected daughter who had stepped off the plane from Florence no longer existed. In her place was something forged in ice and absolute clarity. "What's our next move?" I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm. Evelyn leaned back, steepling her fingers. "We don't call them. We don't negotiate. We file an emergency, ex parte injunction to halt the construction immediately. We file fraud and forgery allegations against Richard. We notify the developer that they are participating in the illegal destruction of private property, which will freeze their entire project, and we watch your brother's little startup choke to death when his stolen capital gets frozen in litigation." She looked at me, her eyes gleaming. "Are you ready to go to war, Harper?" I thought of Grandpa Arthur's wooden stool buried in a storage unit. I thought of my walls, lying in a dumpster. "No," I said, standing up. "War implies they have a chance of winning. This is an execution." By noon the next day, Evelyn had filed a mountain of paperwork so aggressive it could have caused a localized earthquake. The emergency injunction was granted within hours by a judge who did not look kindly upon forged signatures or the weaponization of mental health. But Evelyn didn't just want to stop the construction. She wanted to spring a trap. She wanted Richard and Preston to walk right into the teeth of the bear trap they had built themselves. Through a series of strategically vague emails to Richard's corporate attorney, Evelyn requested an immediate site walkthrough to discuss the release of my remaining personal property. To Richard, a man who believed he had already won, this sounded like a surrender. It sounded like his unstable daughter was bringing a lawyer to politely ask for her paintbrushes back. The sky the next morning was the color of bruised iron. The wind whipped through the gaping holes where my windows used to be. Evelyn and I stood on the sidewalk just outside the chain-link perimeter fence. A sleek, black town car pulled up to the curb. Richard stepped out first, wearing a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than my first year of art school. He looked completely unbothered by the dust swirling around his polished Italian leather shoes. Preston slid out of the opposite side, his eyes glued to his phone, his thumb swiping frantically. He wore a designer puffer vest over a cashmere sweater, the unofficial uniform of a tech CEO spending someone else's money. "Harper," Richard said, buttoning his suit jacket as he approached. His tone was infuriatingly magnanimous, like a king pardoning a peasant. "I'm glad you decided to be reasonable about this. We can get the rest of your boxes released from storage by this afternoon. I've even drafted a check to cover your deposit on a new apartment." He reached into his breast pocket, preparing to hand me a piece of paper that he believed would buy my silence. I looked at him. I looked at the man who had forged my name and documented me as insane to steal my home, and I did exactly what my grandfather had taught me to do. I said absolutely nothing. I let the silence hang in the freezing air, heavy and suffocating. Richard's hand stalled halfway to his pocket. His perfectly constructed corporate smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He wasn't used to being stared at with such cold, unblinking indifference. "Look, can we speed this up?" Preston snapped, finally looking up from his phone. "The Series B wire transfer is supposed to clear into my holding account in 2 hours. I have a board meeting at 1. I don't have time to hold your hand through a real estate transition, Harper." I shifted my gaze to my brother. I looked at his bloodshot eyes, the frantic bounce of his knee, the desperate, hollow arrogance of a man who had never actually built anything of his own. I kept my mouth shut. "Are you just going to stand there?" Preston demanded, his voice pitching up, the silence beginning to scrape against his nerves. "Say something." "She isn't here to talk to you," Evelyn said, stepping forward. Her voice cut through the noise of the street like a scalpel. She unclasped her leather briefcase. "I am." Richard's eyes darted to Evelyn, his instincts finally screaming that something was wrong. "And who are you?" "Evelyn Vance. I represent Harper Quinn in all matters regarding the illegal conversion and attempted theft of her property," she said, her tone conversational, pleasant, and absolutely deadly. She handed a thick, bound document directly to Richard. "This is a court-ordered emergency injunction. All construction on this property is frozen, effective immediately." Richard scoffed, though his grip on the paper tightened. "This is a nuisance suit. I am the executor of the overarching trust. The sale of the shell was completely legal." "The sale of the shell was legal," Evelyn agreed smoothly. "But as you well know, Richard, Arthur Quinn established a split ownership covenant. You sold the exterior, but Harper owns the interior rights, the build-out, and the airspace. You conveyed property you do not own." Preston's head snapped up. The color began to drain from his face. "Dad, what is she talking about? What split ownership?" "Shut up, Preston," Richard hissed, his composure cracking. He glared at Evelyn. "You're bluffing. The title cleared. Harper signed the waiver. It's fully notarized." Evelyn didn't blink. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a second folder. But she didn't hand it to Richard. She turned toward the construction gate. The site developer, a heavily built man who had just walked out of the lobby to see why a town car was blocking his dump trucks, paused. Evelyn walked right up to him. "Are you the lead developer on this site?" she asked. "Yeah," the man said, looking warily at the lawyers in the suits. "Who's asking?" "Harper Quinn, the legal owner of the interior rights of Unit 3B, Evelyn said, handing him the folder. "That is formal notice of liability. The sellers you purchased this building from forged my client's signature on the title transfer. They also submitted fraudulent medical documents to bypass notary requirements." The developer stared at the document, his face turning pale. "If your crew removes one more piece of drywall, if you swing one more hammer inside that unit," Evelyn continued, her voice echoing perfectly in the cold air, "we will add you to the federal fraud lawsuit. We will sue your development firm for the illegal destruction of private property. Your entire project will be tied up in litigation for the next decade. Do you understand me?" The developer looked from the legal notice to Richard, his expression twisting into pure rage. He pulled the radio off his belt, his hand shaking. "Cut the power!" The developer roared into the radio. "Cut the mains on the 3rd floor right now! Stop the demo!" Seconds later, the high-pitched screaming of the saws inside the building sputtered and died. The sudden silence that fell over the street was deafening. "Dad!" Preston shrieked, his voice cracking into full-blown panic. "The power? Why are they stopping the demo? If the title is contested, the escrow account freezes. The bank won't release the wire transfer. My runway is gone. My investors are going to pull out." Richard stood frozen, staring at the injunction in his hand. The untouchable CEO, the man who calculated everything, realized he had missed the one variable that mattered. His daughter was no longer afraid of him. "You forged my signature, Richard," I finally spoke. My voice was quiet, but in the dead silence of the halted construction site, it rang like a bell. "You told the state I was insane so you could steal my home. Did you really think I was just going to politely disappear?" Richard looked up at me, his face twisting into an ugly, desperate snarl. "Harper, you don't understand the collateral damage you're causing. You are ruining your brother." "No," I said, looking him dead in the eye, feeling Grandpa Arthur standing right beside me. "I'm just liquidating a toxic asset. The destruction of a $50 million valuation doesn't happen with a massive explosion. It happens with a vibration." As the developer stormed off to scream at his foreman to halt the demolition, Preston's phone buzzed in his hand. Then it buzzed again. And again. The notifications hit his screen in rapid, lethal succession. Evelyn hadn't just filed the injunction with the county clerk. She had legally mandated the title company to freeze the escrow account until the fraud dispute was settled. The bank holding Preston's Series B wire transfer had an automated risk management protocol. The moment the property tied to his collateral was flagged for active litigation and felony forgery, the system reacted. "The wire," Preston gasped, staring at his screen, the color completely draining from his face until he looked like a ghost. "The bank recalled the wire. The transfer was canceled." Richard snatched the phone from Preston's hand, his eyes scanning the emails. The mask of the untouchable corporate titan finally shattered, leaving behind a desperately panicked old man. "This is a glitch. It's an automated freeze. I just need to call the board. I can explain the delay." "Explain what, Richard?" Evelyn asked, her voice cutting through his denial like a diamond blade. "Explain that your collateral is built on a forged signature? Explain that your chief investor is about to be indicted for real estate fraud?" Tech boards love that kind of synergy. Preston grabbed his hair, his breathing turning ragged and shallow. He was hyperventilating. The tech CEO facade had completely evaporated, revealing the spoiled, fragile child underneath. "My lead investor was CC'd on the title dispute. They're pulling out. Harper, they're pulling out. My runway is gone. The company is dead." He looked at me, his eyes wide and wild, expecting the old me to step in. He expected the sister who had spent her whole life shrinking herself to make him comfortable to suddenly fix it. I just looked at him, feeling nothing but the freezing wind against my face. "You should have optimized your assets better, Preston." I turned my back on them and walked away. I didn't look back as Preston started screaming at his father, his voice cracking hysterically in the middle of the street. I didn't look back as Evelyn calmly handed Richard the formal summons for the civil suit. I let them drown in the mess they had made. 2 hours later, I was standing in a windowless corridor of a climate-controlled storage facility on 8th Avenue. The air smelled of cardboard and industrial floor cleaner, the kind of place where people hide divorces, bankruptcies, and dead relatives. A board clerk had handed me a master key to Unit 414. I unlocked the heavy rolling door and pushed it up. The fluorescent lights flickered on, revealing my entire life neatly stacked in cold, anonymous cardboard boxes. Canvases I had spent hundreds of hours on were wrapped in cheap industrial plastic. Crates of my reference books were shoved into a corner. And there, wedged between a stack of drop cloths and a box of winter coats, was Grandpa Arthur's old wooden stool. It still had the deep gouge in the seat from when I was 12 and had accidentally dropped a palette knife. It was my first tiny crime in the studio, my first lesson that accidents leave evidence. I walked over and placed my hand on the worn wood. And right there, in the quiet, sterile hum of the storage unit, the sheer exhaustion of the last 48 hours finally caught up with me. My phone started ringing. It was a number I had blocked, circumvented through a different line. I knew who it was. The old Harper would have ignored it, terrified of the confrontation. The new Harper swiped right to answer. I wanted to hear the temperature of their defeat. "Harper," Richard's voice came through the speaker. It was low, strained, and stripped of all its usual corporate arrogance. It was the voice of a man standing on the edge of a cliff. "Don't hang up, please." "You have exactly 30 seconds, I said. "We can fix this quietly," Richard pleaded, speaking fast. "The developer wants to salvage the project. If you drop the injunction and sign a retroactive waiver for the interior rights, the title clears today. Preston's investors will reinstate the wire. I will personally write you a check for $500,000. Clear, liquid cash. You can buy a better studio, a beautiful one." I traced the gouge in Grandpa Arthur's stool with my thumb. "You really don't get it, do you? You still think you can buy your way out of the hole you dug?" "Harper, please." Preston's voice suddenly cut in. He was on speakerphone, and he sounded like he had been crying. "This is my life. This..." If this funding falls through, I have to declare bankruptcy. The startup goes into receivership. I lose everything. You are destroying my life over a room." "It's not a room," I said softly, the silence of the storage unit pressing in around me. "It was my sanctuary, and you didn't care if I ended up homeless as long as it kept your ego funded." "I was desperate," Preston sobbed, the arrogance completely gone, replaced by pure, pathetic terror. "Dad said you wouldn't fight back. He said you were too weak to do anything about it. Please, Harper, you're my sister. You always help. You owe me this." That sentence hung in the air. You owe me this. Even as his life was burning to the ground, he still believed my purpose on earth was to be his safety net. I closed my eyes and I felt a heavy, invisible chain snap inside my chest. The chain of guilt, of obligation, of longing for a family that had never actually existed. "I don't owe you anything," I said, my voice steady, cold, and final. "You made a business decision. Now you get to live with the market correction. If you or Richard contact me again outside of a courtroom, Evelyn will file harassment charges." "Harper, wait, don't—" I ended the call. I turned off my phone, letting the silence of the storage unit wash over me. It wasn't the silence of being ignored. It was the silence of absolute power. For the first time in 30 years, I was completely alone, and I had never felt more secure. The gavel didn't bang. Real courtrooms aren't like television. The destruction of a man's empire happens in quiet, sterile rooms with fluorescent lighting and the dry rustle of legal documents. At the emergency hearing, my father and brother sat at the defense table. They wore their $1,000 suits, but the fabric seemed to hang loosely on them now. Richard looked like he had aged a decade in 48 hours. His posture, usually so commanding and rigid, was slightly slouched. Preston couldn't stop his leg from bouncing. He looked physically ill, staring blankly at the polished mahogany table as his tech empire evaporated in real time. Evelyn Vance didn't raise her voice once. She didn't need to. She laid out the facts with the clinical precision of a surgeon amputating a diseased limb. She presented the split ownership trust, the forged signature on the title transfer, and the timeline proving the sale was aggressively pushed to meet Preston's funding deadline. But the moment that sealed the coffin was when Evelyn submitted the fraudulent medical addendum to the judge. The judge, a severe woman with no patience for corporate entitlement, read the letter Richard had drafted, the one declaring me psychologically unstable to bypass the notary. When she looked up, the disgust on her face was absolute. "Mr. Quinn," the judge said, her voice dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. "You attempted to legally weaponize your daughter's mental autonomy to circumvent property law. You forged a signature on a multi-million-dollar commercial transfer. This court is granting the permanent injunction. The interior rights of Unit 3B remain entirely with the plaintiff. Furthermore, I am forwarding this docket to the district attorney's office with a strong recommendation for criminal fraud and forgery indictments." Preston buried his face in his hands. A sharp, pathetic sob echoed in the quiet courtroom. Richard sat completely paralyzed, staring at the judge as if she had just spoken to him in a foreign language. The untouchable liquidator had just been liquidated. As we walked out of the courtroom, Richard tried to step into my path one last time. His eyes were glassy, his voice a desperate, gravelly whisper. "Harper," he said, "you've ruined us. He was your brother. For God's sake, you're the younger sister. You were supposed to support the family." I stopped and looked at him. I looked at the man whose approval I had spent 30 years starving for. I realized then that my role had always been defined by my utility. The quiet, compliant younger sister who asked for nothing, expected nothing, and was supposed to happily sacrifice her life the moment the golden child needed a stepping stone. "I didn't ruin you, Richard," I said, my voice perfectly steady. "I just stopped letting you use my bones to build his foundation." I walked past him and pushed through the heavy double doors into the bright sunlight. The fallout was swift and brutal. Within a week, Preston's lead investors formally withdrew, citing the frozen collateral and the pending criminal investigation. His startup filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy before the end of the month. The developers, terrified of being dragged into a federal fraud case, negotiated a settlement with Evelyn. They salvaged the exterior shell project, but legally cemented my permanent, unbothered stewardship of the interior airspace, and Richard stepped down as the CEO of his firm, frantically liquidating his own offshore assets to pay for a criminal defense attorney to keep him out of federal prison. They started speaking in the language of consequences for the very first time in their lives. A month later, I walked back to my building. The massive steel scaffolding was still there, but the demolition crew was gone. The site was eerily quiet. I unlocked the heavy iron front door and walked up the dark stairwell, my boots kicking up the lingering white dust. When I stepped into Unit 3B, it didn't look like home anymore. It looked like a war zone. The interior was gutted. The floorboards were ripped up, exposing the raw subflooring. The drywall was stripped down to the pale, skeletal wooden studs. The massive windows were still gone, leaving the space open to the biting autumn wind. I stood in the center of the wreckage, holding Grandpa Arthur's battered wooden stool in my hand. I set it down on the rough floorboards. I waited for the grief to swallow me. I waited for the heartbreak of losing the only space I had ever loved. But the grief never came. Instead, the late afternoon sun broke through the clouds, pouring through the empty window frames. It cast long, brilliant beams of golden light across the dust, landing exactly on the spot where my easel used to stand. The light was still there. Richard had taken the walls, but he couldn't touch the light. They hadn't destroyed my life. They had destroyed an illusion. The illusion that if I just stayed quiet enough, if I just asked for little enough, my family would eventually love me. I reached into my heavy canvas jacket and pulled out a thick stick of raw black charcoal. My fingers didn't shake. I walked over to the only remaining slab of intact, unpainted drywall. I pressed the charcoal against the surface and drew the first line. It was dark, certain, and completely unapologetic. They had tried to turn this space into capital. I was going to turn it back into meaning. If there is a moral to this story, a lesson buried in the dust and the forged paperwork, it is this. The moment your family looks at you and sees a resource instead of a human being, they stop being your family. They become a business. And the second you stop being useful to that business, they will discard you without a second thought. That realization hurts like hell. It will break you down to your foundations. But once the dust settles, you will look around at the empty space they left behind, and you will realize something beautiful. It is the exact moment you finally belong entirely to yourself.